This show is brought to you by SalCal Real Estate Connections. We're here with the author of The Final Revelation, The Sun Project, Rick Teles, and of course yours truly, Larry Mangello. And tonight's show, in response to a Freedom of Information Act request, there's a lot of projects being handled by ATTIP. The question is, Rick, is why are they handling these projects?
Yeah, this has been, you know, if you follow this stuff, this has been a pretty exciting week. What we learned this week is, or this month, let's say, in the past week we learned that there were a list of 38 projects that were conducted under the direction of ATTIP, which is the Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program that we heard about, that the Pentagon ran, which was very, very secret from 2007 to 2012. And in that list of 38 projects, I think it's blown away a lot of people. I mean, they say it reads like something out of sci-fi fantasy.
Wow.
And the question as we look at some of these projects is, why were they conducted under this ATTIP, Advanced Aerospace, Threat Identification Project, instead of being placed under DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or under NASA? And when we talk about some of them, you'll see what I'm talking about. So as we go through this, the question is, if they were sponsored under ATTIP, does that mean there was a perceived potential or an immediate threat for what we call non-terrestrial type of actors? When they announced ATTIP, which was sponsored by Senator Harry Reid, this whole program, they kind of pushed it aside and said, well, a lot of this is because there's a lot of unidentified aerial phenomena out there that might be China or might be Russia. And if that's true, I mean, and we know that's true, that they were looking at that, and we have to look at that, but that's what we consider terrestrial. When we start to look at some of these projects, we're going to find that some of them have to do with non-terrestrial. So we're not talking about China or Russia here. All right.
Oh, boy.
And the other question is, as we look at some of these projects, and like I said, it reads like sci-fi fantasy. Some people said, well, this was just blue sky thinking. They were just trying to decide if this stuff was possible. Well, I can tell you that some of this stuff exists. For example, there was one project out there called State-of-the-Art and Evolution of High-Energy Laser Weapons. Well, we now have the laser weapons system, or LAWS, which are mounted on some of our naval ships. They also talked about a thing called invisibility cloaking, and we now have functional invisibility for aircraft. So some of these projects resulted in some very real technologies. And then the other thing is, as we look at these, we're going to be going back to that discussion we had about Silvano Colombano, the professor from the NASA Ames Research Center.
The white paper.
The white paper, who he came out and he said a number of things. One, that interstellar travel may be possible. That an advanced alien race would not use radio signals for primary communications. We're going to see a project in here that looks at gravity waves for communication. We're going to talk about, he talked about that intelligent extraterrestrial life may not be carbon-based. And we're going to see a project along those lines. And we're going to talk about, he had said that Earth has been and is currently being visited by extraterrestrial life. Well, all that is fine, and you wrote that paper. Well, all of a sudden, this list of 38 projects comes out under the Freedom of Information Act. And what it actually was is the Freedom of Information Act requested information about any project conducted under ATTIP. But what we find is that the original letter for this was actually directed to Senator McCain.
McCain, yeah.
He wanted to know too. So this was what was given to the Congress as to, here's what we're doing in secret. Now, I can also tell you that they weren't told everything, because I was able to dig out 3 other projects that were never placed in the list of 38 projects. So we're going to take a look real quick at these projects, and then we're going to look and we're going to ask the question, why ATTIP and not NASA or DARPA? And then we're going to let you decide whether or not these projects were aimed at a terrestrial threat, such as China or Russia, or did they imply that there was a non-terrestrial threat out there that we needed to be aware of?
Now, who actually submitted this Freedom of Information request?
This was this Freedom of Information request was requested by Dr. Stephen Aftergood.
Okay.
who's he's a member of a group of scientists in Washington, and they had asked this question. And it was interesting because what the Defense Intelligence Agency did is instead of giving them a new list, they just pulled out the document that they had handed to the senators, to the Congress a year before.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to take a look at that, and again, why ATTIP and instead of placing it somewhere else?
Well, I'm not sure the viewers know what ATTIP means. Could you touch on that just a little bit?
Yeah, that's the Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program conducted by the Pentagon from 2007 through 2012. And the idea there was to look for advanced aerospace threats. And, you know, they said that primarily this was concerned about, you know, terrestrial threats such as China and Russia. But a lot of people are saying, well, no, there's a bigger piece to this, which was a UFO piece. And we discussed this on one other show, and we did talk about it. I said that, you know, ATTIP was just the tip of the iceberg as far as checking out anomalous, you know, aerial phenomenon. There was a huge UFO component. The other part of this was that some of the technology that was suggested here, or the projects that were suggested, came from another group that is even far more secret than ATTIP, and they're the ones who really have their finger on the beat of what's going on as far as extraterrestrial life is concerned. So let's, you know, why don't we take a look at what some of the projects were?
Absolutely.
And then we can get to it. And again, I have a bunch of slides here, and I'm not going to go through every project. I just wanted the viewers to see how many projects there were. You know, we go here and we're looking at this first slide, and we have a lot of different things here. Advanced nuclear propulsion for manned deep space missions. What does that have to do with it, like China or Russia? Okay, it doesn't as a threat. Advanced space propulsion based on vacuum. Again, what does that have to do necessarily with China or Russia? Traversable, here's one I love. Traversable wormhole, stargates, and negative energy. Now, shouldn't that really be with NASA?
You would think so.
Okay, and biosensors, invisibility cloaking. We go on to the next one, and we have, you know, another 8 here, high-frequency gravitational wave communications. These are all for real. They were doing this. Role of superconductors in gravity research. We're doing a lot of stuff with gravity. Positron aerospace propulsion. There's a beauty right there. Now, here's one that's really interesting. Now, if you want to make the argument that this had to do with China and Russia and nothing to do with, you know, space, one of the projects was an introduction to the statistical Drake equation. Now, if anybody knows anything about UFOs and extraterrestrial life, the Drake equation was actually something that came out in the 60s. And the Drake equation, the purpose of the Drake equation is to predict how many habitable worlds there might be out there that might contain extraterrestrial life. What does that have to do with an advanced aviation threat identification program if it's just for China, Russia, or terrestrial threat? We have biomaterials, which has been around for a number of years. Warp drive, dark energy, and the manipulation of extra dimensions.
Oh, my dear.
Okay, this is real. This is real stuff. So all these shows that we've had where we've talked about this stuff, and we've talked about this stuff many times, and people say, well, you know, that's science fiction. It's not. Here's one that I love. Technological approaches to controlling external devices in the absence of limb-operated interfaces. That's controlling devices without touching them. Remember we talked about
telepathy.
Aerospace applications of programmable matter. This is a real beauty. Programmable matter, okay? Programmable matter is matter that has the ability to change its physical properties in a programmable fashion based upon a user input or autonomous sensing.
Oh, boy.
We're basically talking about matter that can morph. Remember how we talked about living spacecraft that can do different things?
Yes, it fixes itself.
And we have a few more here. Anatronic fusion propulsion. Laser light craft, nano satellites, which actually exist today. We'll talk about what those are. There's a number of things. So we have quantum computing and utilizing organic molecules in automation technology. Remember I talked about in one show about programming microprocessors at the DNA level?
That's right.
That's exactly what that is.
Wow.
Okay. State of the art in the evolution of high energy laser weapons. Okay, we talked about that. All right, so let's get to the point that we're talking about. Normally, when we see some of these projects, they're conducted under DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and we talked about a number of things that they did.
That's right.
So when you consider a special project like ATTIP, and even in the black budget world, you're fighting for all the funding you can get. Why would they use their funding to conduct some of this research unless it was important to their mission? And their mission was to identify advanced aerospace threats.
Wow.
Even if you argue that part of that was China and Russia, and they tried to brush it off that way, when they said the UFO people said, oh, it's about UFOs, oh, no, no. Well, wait a minute. Let's take a look at some of these things. Why is it important to the ATTIP mission to be concerned about high-frequency gravitational wave communications? That's more of a space-based technology.
That's right.
Biomaterials, we talked about the biomaterials that can be used to communicate. Now, a lot of biomaterials, it's been around for 50 years, but that's on a medical basis. We're talking about biomaterials that are made of biological matter. The technological approaches to controlling external devices in the absence of limb-operated interfaces, okay? That's an interesting one, okay? We spoke about that in a book that I wrote. Philip Corso spoke about that. Remember the headbands that they found at Roswell?
Absolutely.
That supposedly these creatures controlled their craft, not by touching controls, but by thinking through it.
Yep.
Well, this is what we have here. Technological approaches to controlling external devices in the absence of limb-operated business. These are real, okay? Aerospace applications of programmable matter. Again, we're creating matter that can be programmed to change, either based on a user input, maybe I type a key or I do something else, or by sensing, autonomous sensing a situation, okay? So, I mean, I'm trying to think of an example of it sensing a situation. Okay, maybe you have a situation where you have a piece of matter that's traveling through space, and now it enters an atmosphere. It has to change its shape to travel through the atmosphere. And what we hear in the sci-fi world is a thing called morphing. That's basically what we're talking about here.
Wow.
Okay. The matter changes itself. Now, what else have we heard that could change itself or change its DNA? Do you remember the discussion we had on that? The octopus.
The octopus, absolutely.
It can change, well, you used RNA, but it can change itself. That's fascinating, okay? Anatronic fusion propulsion. This is a beauty, and this exists. I always thought fusion was something that we really couldn't do. Anatronic fusion propulsion is a propulsion system using fusion, but it creates no neutrons. Neutrons apparently, I'm not a physicist, a nuclear physicist, but neutrons apparently are the dangerous part of fusion. But without the neutrons, you don't need the shielding that you would need for a regular reactor. All you need is the shielding roughly that you would have for something like X-rays. Not only can it generate a propulsion like ions, like the ion engine,
yes,
it can also be an energy source. It's the cleanest, most efficient energy source available.
And in reality, when you go into deep space or interstellar, you don't really want to have fuel with you. I mean, this is very important. This is very important.
You can kind of scoop this up as you go along. Again, this is something that we kind of talked about both in the book and Corso talked about in his book about what was being gleaned from the technology found at Roswell. So it's really fascinating. They have another one in here called metallic glasses. Metallic glasses is basically glass that takes on the properties of metal. All right, but it's a little more flexible. It's a little more elastic. It can handle more heat. The only thing I can think of is the Star Trek episode or the Star Trek movie that talked about transparent aluminum.
Wow.
This is kind of what we're talking about here. All right, so the question I have here again is, why not just put these under DARPA? Now, some of them have moved under DARPA since 2012, but why not let them take care of this the way they normally do their project, unless there was a key requirement of your mission to look at these. And again, their mission was advanced aerospace threats. Let's look at now some other stuff that they had. Normally, you're going to find these projects under NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory or the Ames Research Center. Advanced nuclear propulsion for manned deep space missions. What does that have to do with advanced aerospace threat identification program? Unless the threat is non-terrestrial, right? Not China or Russia. Advanced space propulsion based on vacuum, space-time metric. And this is very close to being real. What that's about is there are vacuums in space. So can you use the vacuums in space to effectively suck you around? Now, we talked about gravity, using gravity waves for transportation. That's right. How extraterrestrials might do it. And people said, well, that's kind of, where are you coming up with that? Okay.
Yeah, right there.
Traversable wormholes, stargates, and negative energy. What does that have to do with a terrestrial threat? Really nothing. It could be applied against an extraterrestrial or non-terrestrial threat. We're not saying that they exist. We're saying that if there's a potential, they were looking into that. Anti-gravity for aerospace applications. Okay, that could apply to terrestrial issues, but it also applies to non-terrestrial or space. Now, the interesting thing about this one is we've talked about this. Many people have been asking the questions over the last few years. You've all heard, we were talking about the triangular aircraft.
That's right. What is it?
TR3 and TR3B, the
that's
mantra.
it.
That's what it was called, or that's what it was called in the popular media. And some people said that some of it was actually anti-gravity. Well, we now know that we do have anti-gravity capability. Now, what I knew about those, and we didn't talk a lot about it, but what I knew about the TR3B is I knew about a project called Blue Ball, which was a top secret project, sometimes called Hummingbird. But it was called Blue Ball because it was apparently this craft had an engine that was kind of semicircular. There was a ball in it that you can see from the bottom, and it was always blue when it flew. Oh, and that's what the TR3B supposedly does. So now when we talk about things like the TR3B, does it exist? There's a good chance it does exist because this was 2012, the last time they dealt with any of this. But again, why ATTIP and not NASA? Here's one. Again, the introduction to the statistical Drake equation.
Drake equation.
That has nothing to do with terrestrial anything. That's all about the possibility of extraterrestrial life and the number of habitable worlds there might be out there in the universe. So why an ATTIP? Warp drive, dark energy, and the manipulation of extra dimensions. Again, could that be terrestrial? You're not going to really use a warp drive terrestrially because you'll be on the other side of the Earth before you even left. Laser light craft nanosatellites. Now, these exist, okay? These exist today. They are terrestrial. We've all heard of CubeSats, the little satellites about so big.
Yeah.
Well, a laser light craft nanosatellite is basically a CubeSat that is delivered into space on a megawatt laser beam. So it doesn't use the normal launch capabilities. It uses a laser beam to go into space. They exist today. This is not blue sky. This is not sci-fi fantasy. You know, it kind of leads you to the questions, what else is going on that we don't know about? I mean, like I was telling you before, Larry, I dug up 3 others to some of the people I know that were never listed on the 38 that are still top secret. We'll mention those in 1 second. But when I cross-reference this to a couple of things, one is to Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell.
Yes.
A lot of it Corso mentioned.
Yeah, Corso mentioned, absolutely.
And then I cross-referenced to some of the stuff I was told with the people I worked with, and they had told me a lot about this, about the gravity wave communications and gravity communications. They even said that, I quote, SETI is looking in the wrong direction. They're looking for the wrong signals, and the guys told me that it was something totally different. So the point I think I'm trying to make in this show is we have a bunch of projects here that have nothing to do with China or Russia. They can only be relative to non-terrestrial or extraterrestrial threats. So if it's not part of NASA, which is more future, and it's not part of DARPA, which is again, we're going to work on it, and it's part of ATTIP, then that means they must have perceived some type of potential, or they thought there could be a potential, or an immediate threat. Now, I know based on the work I did in the book, there is no immediate threat from the extraterrestrial race we are most familiar with. But there are other races out there, and I suppose they could be a threat.
Well, it sounds like they're embracing the fact that this extraterrestrial activity just may be very, very real.
All of a sudden, doesn't it seem that way?
Yes.
And like I said, this past week has been huge in this field. And some people may look at this and say, what are you getting excited about? that they were actually doing these projects, and these projects actually had to do with non-terrestrial eventualities. So that must mean if they're spending money that they know a lot more than they're talking about, as Columbano suggested.
Yes, right.
Now, I mentioned that there were 3 others that I dug up, and these are real beauties, okay, as to the projects. And we were talking a little bit about it before. Let me mention the first one. Universal linguistics in deep space exploration.
Wow.
Does that suggest being able to communicate with somebody?
It sure does.
In deep, and the linguistics would suggest somebody who doesn't speak our language? Here's another one. And this one is pretty obvious. Weapons capability of an advanced non-terrestrial state. Now, they could have said non-terrestrial civilization, but that's not the way you work in the government. Weapons capability of an advanced non-terrestrial state. Okay, who are we talking about?
So now we're talking about extraterrestrial.
Who are we talking about? And here's another beauty, and we referenced this in the book. We've talked about it on here. We asked the question, could an extraterrestrial, an advanced extraterrestrial race possess the technology to control geophysical events on Earth as well as in space, such as asteroids and comets and moving things? And we know through HARP that we can do some of that on the Earth. Okay, here's the real beauty. Kinetic applications of gravity wave manipulation.
Ooh.
So using gravity to manipulate or kinetically move things in space. So we got 1 to go here, 1 minute to go.
Well, I'm going to tell you, this has been just unbelievable. I cannot believe these projects.
Most people can't. And although we knew that some of them existed, I was really surprised that they announced them. They let them out like this. I think they're going to regret that, but that's what we have for tonight.
Well, it's good to know, Rick, that they're talking about now, and we're getting more and more information. That is definitely a sign of good things.
And, you know, in the next show, we're going to talk about something even more amazing, that NASA has now decided to teach everybody about extraterrestrial life.
Wow. That's a real major breakthrough.
Yeah, so.
Well, I'll tell you, Rick, as usual, you've been right on your game, and I am just at awe of these things going on today. But as usual, time is flying, and I want to thank everybody for viewing in tonight. And please remember to email us at theviewshow@aol.com. We would love to talk to you. And thank you, and Rick, you were right on your game tonight. Good night.